Welcome to Antitrust Futures, the sixth panel in Inframarginalism and Internet, as Wealth Distributors and the Implications for Tech Policy. We have a wonderful group of scholars here to antitrust. We've got Herb Hovenkamp, professor at Penn Law and Wharton. Melamed at Stanford Law. We've got Fiona Scott Morton at the Yale School of Management. We've got Susan Crawford at Harvard, and we've got David Teese at Berkeley's Haas Business School. We're going to do presentations first, as we've been doing throughout the conference. We're going to kick it off with Herb Hovenkamp, who's going to talk to us about the looming crisis in antitrust enforcement. And actually, before I go to Herb, let me note that the audience is very much encouraged to put questions and comments in the chat throughout the session, and we'll be sure to try to get to some of them and address them on stage here towards the end of the panel. Okay, so without further ado, I give you Herb Hovenkamp.
Thank you. Thank you, Ramsey. Thanks very much for inviting me. The paper I'm going to talk about, which is in the postings, is a fairly thick one, and it kind of attacks both of the two tails of the antitrust debate, the left and the right, because I'm very limited in time today, and because the Supreme Court is dominated by the right, I'm going to focus on that, but I've got plenty for other people as well. So please read the paper if you have a chance, and I am going to share my slides. Okay. This paper, which is going to press next week, really deals with what I perceive as resistance or misunderstanding of the role of economics in antitrust in the last decade or so. And so I posed the question, whether antitrust is facing another economics crisis, somewhat like the one in the 1960s, when the Warren Court turned its back on neoclassical economics and began to incorporate a lot of non-economic doctrine, or a lot of doctrine that just doesn't make sense economically, into antitrust analysis. I think it's fair to say, Fiona and I have a paper about this, that the sorry state of antitrust economics in the 1960s is what contributed greatly to the breadth of support for the Chicago School in the 1970s and 80s, simply because the antitrust economics was so outrageous. But since then, the marginal antitrust case has moved very, very significantly to the right, particularly already with the rise of the Burger Court, and pretty much ever since then. Importantly, pretty much everybody in the mainstream today, and including the right, articulate a principle that they call consumer welfare, but they don't all mean the same thing by it. Here's my little picture here. I'll get to the little graph in a second. That graph is simply a photocopy of a page out of the Antitrust Paradox. Everything except the elegant red oval at the bottom, that's me, but everything else on that figure is straight off of Bork's book. The misunderstanding of consumer welfare, I think, results from a couple of things. One is simply a misunderstanding about what the term means and how it is used today. Secondly, error cost anti-enforcement bias has been very strong, really originates with George Stigler's robust attack on oligopoly theory and monopolistic competition theory, and the idea that perfect competition models should more or less triumph over all alternatives. And that has left the consumer welfare principle subject to a fair vulnerability. But just briefly to state, for Bork, consumer welfare meant a trade-off. In fact, he borrowed the consumer welfare principle from a piece by Oliver Williamson 10 years earlier. Oliver Williamson did not call it a consumer welfare model. He called it a welfare trade-off model, in which you traded productive efficiency gains from a practice such as a merger against the deadweight loss. And this picture that's in Bork's book is actually a variation of a picture that was in this very well-known, widely cited article by Ollie Williamson in the late 1960s. The trade-off part of the model got a lot of attention. What did not get very much attention is what I put in the little red oval at the bottom. In this particular picture, you've got a welfare trade-off, but you also show output going down by half. Now, of course, it doesn't always go down by half when you have a joint venture or merger that produces efficiencies as well as creates market power. The amount output goes down depends on the shape of the demand curve, the extent of the efficiencies, but it does invite the question, exactly how many mergers or joint ventures that result in very significant output reductions also produce the very significant types of efficiencies that Bork claimed for them, particularly when you think of the fact that most markets that are susceptible to monopolization also have high fixed costs. And high fixed costs, of course, are inversely proportional to output. As output goes down, high fixed costs go up in direct proportion. And I think this is why the consumer welfare principle got a bad name. First of all, people understood it the way Bork understood it. I think coincidentally, price cost margins in the United States have increased significantly since the 1980s. I think it would be naive to lay all of that at the feet of Robert Bork, but there's no question that Bork promoted a view about antitrust that worshiped what turns out to be output reducing practices and higher price cost margins in the name of efficiencies. At the same time, however, antitrust is economic. I don't know how you can avoid that. The statutes speak in economic terms such as restraint of trade, monopoly, competition. Offsetting that has been a very broad attempt, particularly on the left, to use antitrust as kind of a fix-all for the world's problems. And I do think one important value of economics and antitrust is to maintain the boundaries of antitrust law as opposed to, say, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is legitimately concerned about low wages and high output, and concerns about discrimination in the workplace, concerns about the distribution of wealth, and so on. We've got lots of parts of the legal system that address those questions, but antitrust is not a cure-all for all of them. I just want to look at a couple of things here that I developed in the paper. One is market power and questions of fact or law. Very famously now in Ohio versus American Express, Justice Thomas held that you have to define a market in order to measure power.
We have 1 minute remaining in the presentation, please.
Thank you. In order to define market power, to assess market power in a vertical restraints case, this is contrary to a lot of development in econometrics today, with economists looking and developing powerful methodologies for developing market power that don't require the definition of a relevant market. And then if you look in the conservative statements in the House Judiciary Committee, you see statements from groups like Freedom Works, Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Bork Foundation, so on, arguing, making a technical argument. They're not citing a single bit of economic literature that antitrust has to stick with classical market definition approaches. And of course, it's because when you start measuring market power directly, particularly in differentiated markets, you tend to find it somewhat more quickly than you do through traditional mechanisms. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. So our next presenter is.
So I told Ramsey the title of my talk would be The Uncertain Importance of Antitrust Economics. It's intended to be ironic because I actually think that sound antitrust economics is critically important to antitrust law. And I therefore find Herb's excellent analysis to be rather depressing. And I completely agree that antitrust law is and ought to be focused on economic welfare. I would put the reference to the statutes a little differently from the way Herb did. To me, what's striking about the key substantive antitrust provisions is that they all focus on bad conduct, restraint of trade, exclusive dealing, merger. They're not focusing on bigness or on power or on status and so forth. Anyhow, so I want to start where Herb left off, and I want to rephrase his proposition just a little bit to be, I think, that the generalist judges get economics wrong time and time again, and the result has been generally speaking, erring on the side of defendants. And that naturally suggests the question, what are we going to do about that? One possibility is to move antitrust litigation to specialized courts with presumably expert judges. That has a lot of its own problems. I think it's a political non-starter. I'm going to leave that aside. Another possibility is to educate generalist judges better. That is ideally the right solution because antitrust law has evolved through a kind of common law-like process. And the most obvious way for judges to improve upon that process is for them to be better economists. But how are we going to do that? We could have conferences that are funded by someone who's not a libertarian and kind of bring them up to date on modern economics. But I suspect that's going to be a very limited value because antitrust doctrine, antitrust law embeds a lot of economic propositions in it. It's judge-made law. And I don't know how a few hours a year are going to equip judges to deal with the new questions they're going to be facing next year or tomorrow. The next generation of judges might, of course, be more sophisticated, but they're a generation away. So how about legislative change to recalibrate antitrust doctrine? Antitrust law today includes a host of legal propositions, burden of proof standards, rules like those set forth in cases like Brook Group and Trinco and American Express that seem to be based on out-of-date or just plain wrong economics. Maybe the law could be recalibrated by replacing it with propositions that reflect up-to-date economic learning and support the conclusion, among others, that the law should no longer tilt so far to avoiding false positives at the expense of false negatives. As I understand, that's what Senator Klobuchar's bill is intended to do, and it's what a lot of progressive scholars, like Fiona and many others, are recommending. They're motivated by lots of data, suggesting that antitrust laws have not achieved their economic objectives because they have been too deferential to defendants, to laissez-faire their orientation. Legislation might well be the very best solution. It can certainly be accomplished more quickly than relying on judges to change by a common law-like process, but it has some risks, right? The law could get it wrong or could get it right today and become obsolete in light of new learning or new economic challenges. The legislation could become a Christmas tree that reflects all sorts of political compromises that have little to do with sound economics. And if antitrust doctrine is seen as a subject of legislative calibration, who knows what might happen next? History shows that the powerful tend to be pretty influential in legislation over the long run. One reason the legislative approach is risky is that the most vocal proponents of the new antitrust legislation are not the progressives, it's the populists on both the left and the right. These include the House Antitrust Subcommittee minority staff, Senator Hawley, Senator Warren, and many others. They would ignore economics and focus antitrust law on attacking inequality and the big tech platforms that would avoid the problem of economic errors by judges, but at the expense of economic welfare. And that could be a considerable expense. So the challenge is to enact legislation without having to make compromises with the populists or others that will take antitrust law even further from sound economics. I want to suggest a factor that I think has been overlooked in the discussion. Antitrust law has become very technical and arcane. I think that's one of the reasons judges struggle with it. And when they're at sea or confused, or they tend to default to ideology. And the populists are troubled by those technical aspects of antitrust law for a somewhat different reason. They lament, or some of them do, that antitrust law has become undemocratic and captured by technocrats. So maybe the solution is to try to simplify antitrust law. For the chart moves in that direction a bit. Let's go further. If you look behind all of the doctrinal categories and the shorthands and the questions, about in antitrust law, and we can see the core of antitrust law. It's really very simple. The core of U.S. antitrust law is this: antitrust law prohibits anti-competitive conduct that increases market power. Period. If I'm right about that, we can do away with all the categorical analysis. We can stop asking whether the pricing conduct at issue in the case is a loyalty discount, a bundled discount, predatory pricing, exclusive dealing, or tying. And by the way, things that are often called loyalty discounts could be characterized as any of those five. Why do we have those arguments with all the formalistic and analogic thinking that those kinds of questions prompt? Instead, why don't we just ask the courts to address two questions? First, did the defendant engage in anti-competitive conduct? And by anti-competitive conduct, I mean conduct that does not increase product quality, does not reduce costs, and does not lower above cost prices. Conduct, in other words, that does not increase economic welfare. Second, did that conduct increase, or is it likely to increase, the defendant's market power? In the Section 2 case, we talk about monopoly power. Questions that have to be very slightly reworked in a merger case, but we can ignore that for now. Maybe judges would have more success with fewer, simpler, more conceptual questions. They can answer those questions with ordinary reliance on direct or circumstantial evidence. And the economists, as in multitudes of other cases, would be called upon to address factual questions rather than to try to persuade the judge of what doctrinal category or conceptual framework the judge ought to be using. Simplifying antitrust law might have another advantage. Antitrust law applies to almost all forms of commercial conduct. Its principal value is found not in the litigated cases, but in the anti-competitive conduct it deters and the pro-competitive conduct that it does not deter. A simpler law might give better guidance to the business community and reduce the considerable efforts of lawyers to make formalistic changes to conduct in order that it might be seen as belonging in a more friendly category. I acknowledge, by the way, that the two questions I described do not help the court decide what to do when you have both harm and benefit. But current antitrust law doesn't solve that problem either. It simply says balance, and no court has ever figured out what that means. So almost all courts duck the question by agreeing with the plaintiff or the defendant. They either find no benefit or no harm. I think we can do better than that. That's a different conversation. Anyhow,
there's one minute.
If we want antitrust, well, I can do it less than that. If we want antitrust law to be based on sound economics, I think we have to change the law, because I don't think we're going to be able to change the people. And if you want to change the law, simpler might be better than more complex. That's it.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So we're going to move on now to Fiona Scott Morton.
Okay, hi everybody. I want to take us in a slightly different direction, although not unrelated, rather, I hope, highly related, which is, again, what are the limits of antitrust? I think we've had a lot of pushing for the last 4 or 5 years for the reasons that Doug just articulated to start using the antitrust laws more effectively in the United States. And in particular, we've watched Europe for 10 years litigate against digital platforms. Not that that really accomplished anything, but they did it. And the United States has done nothing. And then between October and December of 2020, suddenly the floodgates opened, and we got the House report and a case against Facebook by the states, and a case against by the FTC, and a case against Google Search by the DOJ, and a case against Google Ad Tech by the states, and another case against Google Search by the states. So we suddenly had this outpouring of antitrust activity. And I think that when regular people use the term antitrust, and I mean regular by people like not on this call, but otherwise everybody else, they think of antitrust as the government restraining corporate power or corporate profit. The government controlling corporations. They do not think of it the way we think of it, which is you have to violate a very specific thing, as Doug just described, and then ex post the government can come after you. So in other words, most people think about antitrust as antitrust and regulation put together. And what they're going to learn when they come out of COVID and recover from insurrection and so forth is that the first hearing in the Google search case is September 2023. And then there'll be an appeal, and then there'll be some discussion of remedies. And maybe in 6 or 8 years, there'll be some kind of change in the search market. And that's, I think, not going to be enough for the people who thought that filing a case against Google in December 2020 was actually going to achieve something. On top of that, we have the problems that are often, that many commentators would like antitrust to fix, that are very difficult for antitrust to fix because it wasn't designed to fix it. So, for example, how should the terms and conditions on a website be laid out so that people can actually see them, rather like the nutrition label on your loaf of bread? What should my rights over my own data be? Can I control what other people do with it? How would I get paid for my data? What kinds of interoperability requirements should there be between different businesses or sides of a market? Those kinds of issues, some of them are competition, like interoperability, but some of them are, you might loosely say, consumer protection, data and privacy and fraud and addiction and other things that can happen in digital businesses. So it seems to me that there's going to be a lot of social pressure to fix all the things that antitrust can't fix. And then there's going to be a lot of social pressure to achieve competition before 2030. And that both of those things could be achieved by regulation, by either Congress establishing a digital regulator or Congress establishing a piece of the FTC that does this, or some other solution that I haven't thought of. But that this would be a response. I don't think that the social pressure for reform is going to go away just because these cases were filed. Moreover, everybody's going to be watching the European Union and their progress on the DMA. What does the DMA do? I'll spend 1 minute on that and then wrap up. So the Digital Markets Act says we're going to regulate digital platforms ex ante. You're going to be regulated if you're sufficiently large and you have activities in Europe, and that's pretty formalistic, and you don't get to argue about it, and it's called gatekeeper status. And once you have gatekeeper status, there's 5 things you absolutely have to do, and another 6 things you absolutely have to do, and another 12 things that you probably have to do. And all of those rules seem to come from past cases. You can a little bit recognize Google, you can recognize Spotify, you can recognize Amazon, but they're not stated with those names in them. They're stated as a general rule that all the gatekeeper platforms will have to adhere to. So a rule designed for Google will have to be followed by Facebook and Amazon and Apple and so on. It's a little bit awkward. I think they're going to need to revise it to make it more effective and for the rules to match the business models a little bit better. But nonetheless, it's quite aggressive. It's quite fast moving. This was released in December. They want to vote on it in a year. And we're going to have regulation in Europe while the United States is busy prepping motions in our antitrust cases, and nothing happens here. So I think that this is just an area to watch because I don't think people are going to be so satisfied with the antitrust process, not just because of the judges and because of the law, and I agree with everything Doug said, but because even when we do it right, we have bigger problems in this particular space than antitrust probably can handle completely on its own. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that, Fiona. I'd like to just remind the panelists that when you're not speaking, please make sure that you have your mic muted. We've been getting some feedback so far. So our next speaker will be David, and I will be running slides for David. So let me get those up here.
Thank you, Ramsey. Let me pick up where Herb started, which is that it's hard to imagine competition policy without economics. He also points out that really what's dominated economics is what I call static economics, not just Chicago school microeconomic models, but subsequent developments. And as some of you know, I've been pushing for dynamic economics, innovation-driven analysis. But we've had a situation has arisen where, because economics has been slow at coming up with a paradigm that actually addresses the concerns that most of us have, economics is now very much on the back foot. And so my fight to bring dynamic competition to bear, I think seems to be a losing cause. In static economics, or all economics seems to be marginalized now. And a great case study of that is what Fiona is referring to, which is a Digital Marketing Act in Europe. And I use this as a precursor or a case study of where things are likely to go globally. And it really, I suppose, in some sense, reflects the failure of economics. So let me just run through quickly some slides here. Next slide, please, Ramsey. The EU's Digital Markets Impact Assessment Study, I mean, it does have a few highlights that I like. It recognizes that digitization of services is associated with widespread innovation and increased competition. But then it goes on basically to say that competition is actually held at bay. There's a fundamental misunderstanding of competition, in my view, because people are looking at it through static eyes. And existing competition policy, I think, has let us down, and the result is get significant regulation. Next, please, Ramsey. Next slide, please, Ramsey. It was interesting that the study in Europe was done by interviewing stakeholders, which included competitors, which included national authorities, which included academics, but no one did any study of the benefits, not just of consumers, but the longer-term benefits to the European economy from having access to new business models and related things. Next, please. So that, to me, indicates that it's a political process. It's not been searching for deep economic answers. And I highlighted this comment that the egregious conduct identified was unequal opportunities for innovation. And I believe there should be great opportunities for innovation. But in fact, the Digital Marketing Act essentially, I think, is going to close down a lot of opportunities for innovation, certainly for systemic innovation, maybe some improvement in Me Too innovation around the edge of platforms, but the core of platforms will be hampered, and I think the Europeans will suffer significant negative consequences from that, even if a few individual firms benefit. Next slide, please, Ramsey. Provisions include allowing businesses to promote offers to end users acquired via the core platform, portability of business user data, search, query, and check data to be made available to third parties. This is very radical surgery. This is essentially a form of deep regulation. It's treating platforms as essential facilities And the result of this is that you're not going to get the investment in the platforms. The Europeans are hoping, the big gamble is that somehow or other companies will keep on innovating and that they'll get this incremental edge innovation. They won't lose anything. That's a hell of a gamble. And the costs of that gamble, I think, are very great and likely to be very great. Next slide, please. There's serious flaws in economic analysis. First of all, completely ignoring broad spectrum dynamic competition. The big tech companies don't sit in their own swim lanes. Relevant markets are basically irrelevant. You have to think of their capabilities and data orchestration as driving broad spectrum competition. And that is what we need to look at. The Digital Marketing Act promotes free riding. Most economists recognize that if you allow free riding, you don't get investment in the underlying assets that are being ridden on. So the unquestionably significant negative incentive effects are going to follow from not just allowing free riding, but actually promoting it. So the Digital Marketing Act, in my view, is going to curtail investment in R&D and blunt innovation by incumbent platforms. The gamble is somehow or other that incremental innovation around the edge will offset that. Incremental innovation almost never trumps core innovation or systemic or architectural innovation. Next slide, please. So the basic point there is that innovation economics has gone out the window. What are the likely competitive effects? Incentives to promote or expand innovation on existing platforms are impaired. The impacts on systemic innovation, not even discussed, not like they discuss it and ignore it and say it doesn't matter, not even aware of it. And one way to think about this as an economist is that a lot of this is functionally equivalent to imposing compulsory licensing around data while simultaneously narrowing the scope of a patent. So I think that the consequences are not going to be what the Europeans expect. The DMA certainly doesn't favor dynamic competition. In my view, doesn't favor static competition either. So I guess we should recognize it's completely politically motivated, but the study should have actually tried to calculate what the costs are and say, okay, we want a different system. Politically, we don't like large firms, and we're willing to sacrifice GDP, productivity, and wages to do so. In fact, they claim the opposite, but there's absolutely no basis for the claim that it's going to increase productivity, that it's going to increase employment, other than the employment of lawyers and economists, of course. Next slide, please. Well, just briefly on the App Store, it would dramatically cut what the pricing of the platform would allow. No attention given to what it is that the channel captains or the platform captains do. Orchestrating and curating platforms is a very important function for the consumer experience and for innovation more generally. So I think that would be significantly impaired, but no analysis of that either. Next slide, please, Ramsey. Next slide, please. Yeah. So if any one of these four propositions are true, I believe the DMA is going to be a disaster for the EU. One, if systemic innovation is important to the EU's long-term prosperity and competition. It has been in almost every economy. That's the true radical stuff that redefines industries. If that's important, then the DMA is going to be shooting Europe in the foot. If edge innovation is mainly Me Too, edge innovation around smaller firms that want access to the platform, if that's mainly Me Too, you don't get anything fundamentally different from it that's better. Okay. And if big tech's already significantly competitive, then that's another reason why this is a disaster. So there's multiple reasons why this policy move, I think, is likely to harm Europe. Next slide, please. And maybe actually go, let me just use this last slide as one to reiterate my basic themes. When I was an undergraduate student, I read this book, Le Défi Américain, which was the Europeans worried about American technology firms in the form of IBM and General Motors. This is back in the 60s. And one bold European French politician got up and said, "It's time for us to take stock and face the hard truth. What threatens to crush us today is a more intelligent use of skills. What Europe needs is the ability to transform an idea into reality through the talent for coordinating skills and making rigid organizations flexible." Europe is riddled with bureaucratic organizations that are not particularly flexible. What they're doing here is, instead of focusing on the transformation of their own industry and their own regulatory structures, is trying to clamp down on the winners. So I think the result here is going to be unfortunate. The solution does not lie with the DMA. The solution lies with changing the regulatory environment, and it also relies on better management. Economists kind of don't have a place for managers in the economic model of competition. But managers matter. There's absolutely no doubt.
David, I'm afraid that our time has come to an end. If you could just wrap it up in a few words, please.
I'm done. Just don't forget that managers matter and that firms are not black boxes.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation, David. So now we move to Susan Crawford. Please, Susan, take it away.
Hey, well, thanks for having me here. I'm a bit orthogonal. I've spent years writing about a market that's been subject to neither antitrust enforcement nor regulation. But I agree with Fiona's suggestion that antitrust isn't always the way to go. That's going to be my bottom line at the end of this. Here's my subject. In this divided, fractured time of partisan insurrections, it's good to know that all Americans have one thing they can agree on, and that is our shared irritation at the state of internet access in America. It is truly a nonpartisan issue. We are systematically underserved and overcharged as a country. And COVID has revealed the unbelievable unfairness of access for millions of Americans who can't ensure that their kids are educated or they have access to healthcare because access is too expensive. The pandemic revealed suddenly that 30% of families in San Francisco couldn't have their kids going to school at home. The numbers are like 80% on tribal lands, 40% in Baltimore, 70% in San Antonio. These are cruel facts. And like everything about COVID, we're learning a lot. We do know that having a sufficient connection at home is tightly correlated with socioeconomic status. We also know that people of color are disproportionately affected by this issue. Internet access is necessary, not sufficient, but necessary for every policy we care about as a country. For climate adaptation, for improving our healthcare system, improving education, improving the quality of jobs that Americans can have, it's absolutely necessary. But among the OECD nations, we're in the bottom third when it comes to affordability of access and high quality access. Although we have terrible data in this area, I'd like you to learn about this market. The best non-ISP reported data suggests that about 157 million Americans aren't using the internet at anything approaching modern day speeds. Let me tell you how terrible this data is. The FCC says that Kentucky, if you're in that state, 93% of you have access to high-speed internet services. But the portion of the state actually using the internet at modern speeds is more like 31%. And again, it's a damning problem for that state and for many states across the country. Law and policy got us into this fix, and law and policy can get us out. Antitrust and regulation energy really is focused on the platforms, and I have to applaud the telecoms for getting us in this situation. They have been telling the FCC and others for years, don't look at us, look at those guys, look at Google, look at what they're doing. And this indirection has worked because we are not focusing on this truly vital issue of infrastructure that feels like a utility, but where we have the worst of both worlds, no oversight and no competition. So I want to introduce you to this underexamined market in hopes I can get my antitrust experts here to pay attention to it. The market is high-speed internet access over a wire plus Wi-Fi to the home. There's a separate complementary market. You use your mobile phone also for high-speed internet access, but it's very different. And if you can afford it, you get both. There are sharp data caps and overages associated with wireless usage. There also is the fact that people using a wire at home use 40 times as much data every month as someone using a wireless phone. So these are two separate markets. In that market, the vast majority of Americans have no choice. And if they have a choice, it's very expensive. And millions more have no provider at all. How did we get here? Well, back in 04, 05, we deregulated this entire sector. We believed that the magic of competition would have cable fighting it out with the telcos, who would fight it out with wireless. These are not evil companies, but left to their own devices, they divided markets and consolidated. This is a good characterized by enormous upfront costs and extraordinary margins and efficiencies of scale. So it makes sense. And actually, the US government helped in that market division effort. The telephone companies didn't want to compete with the local cable monopolies, so they backed away. So our telephone companies today are mostly wireless companies, that separate market. And local cable monopolies dominate all of our metro areas. And these are second-rate services, as I'll talk about in a minute. As a matter of federal law, exclusive franchises are illegal in American cities. Nonetheless, they persist. A hidden element that I'd love to interest you all in is that state and local governments get a kickback. 5% of video fees, revenue goes to the government. It's very hard to cut away from that. And there are lots of reasons to stay with the free services that are given you by your local cable monopolist. So no one's evil, but boy, this has really happened. Charter and Comcast never enter each other's territories. And if you're looking for optimism about a businesses doing well in COVID, take a look at Charter and Comcast. They are going gangbusters because everybody who can possibly afford it is buying their services. Charter now has 130 billion market cap. Comcast has 213 billion market cap. So they're delighted with all of us focusing on Facebook and Google, and things are going well for them. Right now, there's some attention turning to this issue because of the brutality of the pandemic, but not so far in a way that would disrupt this status quo. There's a huge focus on rural internet access, which is indeed a problem, but it's separate from the staggering problem in urban areas where costs are just out of control and so many people can't afford service, where they would have been able to afford traditional telephone service in the past. We're planning to subsidize rural service. I'm going to tell you that most of that money will go to the nearby cable company, who is telling Wall Street that they expect to have lock-in there, that they expect to have complete market power wherever they extend into rural areas, no competition. So the fix here is either to build around these existing monopolies in a new way, and that's what I've been writing about, by making sure that there's a public work in the form of open access fiber or conduit throughout the country that is controlled and regulated by government, or a second route might be to force the existing providers to open themselves up to competition. But I'm with Fiona, this would take forever, litigation would be painful and ultimately likely fruitless. They have great lawyers. So I've been focused on the former approach. Fiber optic is a better technology, frankly, than what the cable guys are selling us in America. And it's the standard across the world. China plans to get 80 to 90% of their people onto fiber optic last mile networks. So we really should have this structurally separated market where a wholesale network operator who has no retail conflict of interest is leasing out this wholesale fiber to retail providers. In some places, that could be done by government, this wholesale provision, and that is happening in about 1,000 places around the country. The problem is that financing and building last mile fiber is very expensive, and carriers don't invest if they don't think they're going to make that money. And there's no point entering American cities because the barriers to entry are so stupendous. So it is likely this will have to be a local government issue initially. Chattanooga had the same problem, and so its public electric utility built fiber itself. Today, Chattanooga, once the dirtiest city in America, is the leading remote work city in the country because they have this fabulous, cheap fiber access network. I personally prefer treating the wholesale level of these networks like infrastructure of public work, not having the government itself involved in selling internet access. For me, that raises lots of speech issues, but making sure that competition flourishes. And it's happening, and that's why House Republicans have introduced the Communities Overregulating Networks Need Economic Competition Today Act, the CONNECT Act, which would, at a federal level, ban government-run broadband networks across the country. So they would like to make sure that all states limit what cities are doing in this area. So from my perspective, the fix isn't backwards-looking, lengthy antitrust litigation, as Fiona says. Okay, I'll be done in less than a minute. Although under Doug's definition, boy, has there been anti-competitive behavior, like hiring away all the cable installers in a particular area and saying, if you work for any upstart, you'll lose your business with us. But this really is about ex-ante regulation. So I'm with Herb. This is not the place for antitrust to do work. And this is just like the electricity story. Cities and localities are going to start off, will eventually shame the federal government into acting, as FDR did with the 1935 Public Utilities Holding Act, which he viewed as his bravest act in his entire career. He was attacked for going after the private power cartels in America. We now have the same situation with internet access. So that's all I wanted to say, and it's been a delight to listen to everybody today, and I do hope that we make some forward progress. Thanks.
Very much for that presentation, Susan. And I'm delighted to say that Thomas Philippon, professor at the NYU Stern School, has been able to join us as well for this discussion portion of the panel. So welcome, welcome, Thomas. So I want to start off the discussion by trying to provoke you a little with a story, perhaps accurate, perhaps entirely incorrect, about what has transpired in antitrust over the last few years. So when I got into antitrust 7, 8 years ago now, when I was starting my career, I very much approached it from a progressive perspective. I wanted to see change. I wanted to see more enforcement. And I expected that the way that change was going to come about was going to be through some sort of intellectual innovation. So I looked back at the history of the rise of the Chicago School and how antitrust enforcement had sort of wound down over the past few decades. And you encounter the Arley House Conference, this thick conference volume full of, just brimful of these sort of Chicago School ideas. You encounter, arguments like the single monopoly profit theory, or all of the work David referred to, pointing to dynamic competition versus static competition, and so on. And whatever we may think about these theories, and a lot of them have been, I think, rather successfully undermined over the last few decades, the change that was brought about in the 70s, 60s, and 70s and 80s, I think it's fair to say that it came from within the academy, and it was profoundly intellectual in nature and involved winning victories or putting opponents back on their heels intellectually, so that it took them 5, 10, 15, 20 years to sort out what their responses would be. And so I fully expected that once enforcement was going to change again, that would be the source too, that there would be an intellectual development that would, for example, once and for all, let us talk about what the limits are for the need to reward innovation, for example. Where does that stop? And once we know where that stops, then we know when antitrust can intervene, and so on. But that hasn't happened at all. And really the astonishing thing that we've seen over the last few years is that we've seen this reinvigoration of antitrust enforcement, at least with respect to the legal academy. I think the situation is a little bit different in economics, has really come from outside of the field. I can't really point to any major intellectual breakthrough on any of the problems that the Chicago School posed for antitrust economics over the last few years that's driven this. And so I look outside of antitrust and I try to ask, where did the push for enforcement against Google and Facebook and so on come from? And one somewhat cynical perspective on this is that it seems as though what we have here is a clash between competitors, that we have, on the one hand, the tech giants, which have disrupted the traditional media industry. On the other hand, we've got that industry. And one of the distinguishing aspects of the media industry is that it's able to talk. It's able to talk, and it's able to promote, and it's able to advocate. And so we've seen the sort of the profile of antitrust and monopolization arguments really rise dramatically over the last few years. And that seems, interestingly enough, to be filtering back into the academy. So, for example, when I read, Herb's federal antitrust policy casebook, hornbook rather, I noted that, as the editions change every 2 years, that what went from a sort of very unequivocal rejection of refusal to deal as any sort of a viable monopolization claim, except in very rare circumstances, it seemed to soften in the most recent edition. And so the question I have for you is the resurgence of antitrust over the last few years, is it been driven primarily by political considerations, not only industries that are invested in antitrust action against particular industries, but also is it driven by, the public dissatisfaction with this sort of economic status quo being channeled into particular areas, or does it have a firm intellectual basis within the academy? And if not, should it? Does it need it? So I'll let anyone who wants to jump in on this question do so.
Well, let me jump in with just a partial response. I thought Susan's presentation was quite powerful, and as you were speaking, Ramsey, I thought to myself, by the way, this is a bit of a contrivance, but I thought, well, gee, all of this talk about reinvigorating antitrust insofar as it's focused on Facebook and Google hasn't encompassed Charter and Comcast. Why is that? And I think it's not that they don't have, there aren't potential complainants about the economic issues that might motivate a sort of endogenous antitrust revolution. It is that the digital platforms, and in particular the content, the social networks, Google, Facebook, and of course now more recently Twitter, touch a lot of non-economic nerves. They're about speech, they're about political disinformation, they're about privacy, they're about social disintermediation. There's been a history in this country of excessive, aggressive, and in some cases, I think excessive enforcement of the antitrust laws against the then dominant communications media. You start with motion pictures, and then you have broadcast television, and then you have cable in the early days. So anyhow, I think what I'm trying to say is I think a lot of what is being perceived as a kind of revolution about antitrust is not a revolution about the kinds of economic concerns antitrust is concerned with. It's a non-economic revolution that is trying to appropriate the goodwill and institutional framework of antitrust for non-economic purposes.
No, so I would layer something a little more positive on top of that, Doug. I would say that in an environment with hostile courts where defendants get a lot of running room, you need society at large to be upset with this company already before you can bring an antitrust case. It's not like that we aren't awash in antitrust cases we ought to be bringing, but there isn't enough baseline, concern with the behavior of that company to get us over the finish line, I think.
Yeah, let me add one thing too, Ramsey. I think a lot of the movement to expand the boundaries of antitrust has come in an environment where the thinking was we won't be able to get this legislatively by other means. And as a result, the nice thing about antitrust is the statutes are very, very thin. Most of the law is made by judges. And so if you can't get more protection for workers or more protection for equal distribution of wealth through direct legislation in some other source, you try to get it through antitrust. If we're in a regime where we can meet those goals by other means, through whatever, the Telecom Act, Section 230, the Fair Labor Standards Act, I think that'll take some pressure off of antitrust to be the kind of savior of all of the world's problems.
Others like to weigh in on this question?
I'll just directly answer it as I did in the chat. I think that the innovations since the 80s have come in economics, and the economics has not been translated through into the law, partially because there were a lot of moneyed interests who have profit and they didn't want those innovations to be translated into the law. And so shouted out hard on the other side, and partly because I think economists did not understand what was happening and did not invest in translating and trying to communicate to the legal side. And that's my profession's fault. But I think there was a little bit of a lack of understanding of what was actually happening. And then you appoint a conservative judiciary at the same time that is focused on transferring money from the poor to the rich, and it's a perfect storm.
Sorry, I'm interested in that comment actually, because when I saw in the chat that you mentioned that the economics has changed, I thought that what you were going to refer to is the sort of the recent set of mostly empirical studies showing sort of higher markups and over the last few years, the work of the two Jans and also, of course, Thomas's work as well. When you say that these innovations have occurred in economics in the 80s, what in particular are you thinking of?
I'm thinking of the field of applied game theory from the 80s. I'm thinking about the field of econometric measurement of demand and cross-price elasticities from the 90s. I'm thinking about behavioral economics from the last 30 years on switching costs and the role of defaults and so on. If those innovations in economics had moved promptly into the antitrust literature, you wouldn't have statements like it's only a click away, or these products are too narrow, product markets are too narrow, or oligopolists can't collude, predation is never rational. Those things just are not supported by the economics literature at all. And we wouldn't have dug ourselves into this hole if antitrust had adopted stayed at the frontier of the field.
Okay, so if no other comments on that particular question, so I will move on. So part of the question though is also about focus. So why the tech giants in particular? And one argument obviously is they're big, they're there, as has already been mentioned. There's public interest in them, and perhaps they're kind of a gateway drug in some sense to sort of broader antitrust enforcement. But is it also possible that given that we're having a moment now, and that the energy may be finite, that perhaps the focus should be on other industries, other parts of the economy that present perhaps bigger antitrust problems. So obviously Susan has talked to us about one very important one, and I remember noting with interest in reading Thomas's book, The Great Reversal, that his chapter on the tech giants is probably the most equivocal of all the chapters in terms of the concerns he had. So is this focus on the tech giants perhaps at least to some extent driven by the media industry and sort of competitor concerns, or maybe just obviousness to the public? And should we be doing more work to perhaps direct these energies where they can best be spent before they disappear and the political moment moves on?
I support what Doug said about the importance of these platforms dealing with speech, and that those issues are very attractive and salient to younger people who really have gathered in mobs to be upset about Facebook and Google. All of our students are upset. And I'm not so sure that public pressure is what makes antitrust law work or not work, but there is a sort of upsurge in indignation at the role of these platforms that I think goes even beyond what their economic role is. So I just want to suggest that Doug's right. He answered that question. And I do think that the upsurge in youthful scholarship has been really important. Lena Khan's work has driven people to focus on what Amazon can do. And in part because, as Fiona says, she looks at actual market practices in detail. And that has been very helpful to a lot of people.
I'll just say something purely descriptively, which is I teach 100 students at the law school at Penn and another 60 at Wharton. And I think 90% of them in both places are just overwhelmingly concerned about the big digital platforms. They have sucked all of the energy out of the antitrust room. Healthcare, which used to be big, produces a big yawn. Pharmaceuticals produces a yawn. They all want to talk about Google and Facebook. And I think that's going to be with us for quite some time.
Thomas, are you interested in weighing in on this question? We're not getting audio. Well,
while Thomas is getting ready, I think we have to separate two things. One, what's really important in antitrust evolution or reform? And to me, it seems it's clear it is having a sound set of principles and institutions that can deal with a multiplicity of problems across sectors and send the right signals to the business community. On the other hand, it helps to have a catalyst to provoke reform. So we should welcome the platforms and the enthusiasm that Herb reports if it helps us focus on the broader question of antitrust law, not just on specialized laws for the tech platforms. But we, as I say, we shouldn't compromise antitrust law for their specialized industry problems.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I think Thomas is coming back with us here. Thomas.
Wait, can you hear me?
Yes,
now?
we can hear you.
Oh yeah, wonderful. So that's the premise. Yeah. Okay. Whatever. I'm so used to Zoom that. Okay. So first of all, I wanted to say that what Susan said about the telecom, I think, is very important. Look, if you wanted, there's two different things. If you want to put money back in people's pocket, there's two things you need to do in the US: healthcare and telecom. Because if you look at the monthly bill that people pay, and you think about where are they overpriced, and where, if you just think about, how do I get the median household who earns $50,000 a year, how do I get them to pay less and save about, 500, 1,000? I think it's healthcare and telecom. But it's not the easiest battle to win right now. So I think the way to think about going after the big tech is for at least like two reasons. One is the target of opportunity, which is, it turns out that these guys, I mean, look, to some extent, Facebook and Google manage something that nobody has managed in 20 years, which is to get bipartisan support. No other political topic, whether global or local, has managed to have the Democrats and Republicans agree on it until China recently. So Google and Facebook managed to do that. So it would be stupid not to. It would be, you don't want to waste this opportunity. So now there is another reason to go after them, which is something that I've seen a lot in Europe, and I'm sure it's happened in the US in a different way, which is it's harder to go after less successful businesses if they tell you, well, but wait a minute, if you go after me, then Amazon or Facebook or replace your favorite name is going to take over. Okay, but if you've shown that you can be tough with the big dog, it's going to be easier to be tough with the middle dogs. I think that's also an important argument. The main danger is that at the end of the day, this is going to have very, very, very small and indirect impact on people's standards of living in the short term, because they don't pay for it. At best, it's going to reduce the cost of advertising budget, and maybe it's going to have a lower price for the goods, but that's going to be so indirect and so small that this is not the thing that's going to have a big impact on purchasing power.
Great. Thank you for that, Thomas. So I'd like to switch gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about sort of the direction we've been moving with respect to these big tech platforms. And if you'll permit me to abuse history a little bit, in correspondence with Fiona a couple of days ago, it occurred to me that we've been sort of reliving these sort of three stages of grief that we went through back in the Gilded Age with respect to size. So we started out, with sort of fear of bigness. The tech giants are getting too big. But then now it seems like, particularly, listening to Fiona's presentation, for example, listening to Susan talk about, what's at stake with telecom, we seem to be moving towards regulation as perhaps being, the best way to deal with size. And obviously that addresses some of the problems that David has, although he's also very critical of the proposed Digital Markets Act as well. But, and that's what we saw in the Gilded Age as well, right? We saw, yes, we had the Sherman Act, but we also, and we had some, early dalliances with antitrust, for example, with respect to, telegraphs and so on. But the progressive movement really seemed to move on fairly quickly from that towards price regulation, rate regulation, and also to taxation and transfer. And so are we just sort of doomed to repeat this historical cycle? And the reason why, as Herb mentioned, we may have gotten into antitrust to begin with in the last few years as a big cure-all is because we feel like we can't reform the tax system. But maybe what'll end up is, populism will get to a point where we will be able to reform the tax system, and then all of this will, once again become ancient history. So what are your thoughts about that? Is that where we're headed?
A couple of things. First, I think we have to confront the history of regulation, which is that the relationship between regulation and innovation is not pretty. I mean, more often than not, the history of regulation has ended up deterring regulation, throwing it off its tracks, protecting incumbents from upstarts. And so we have to have a fundamental rethink of how to make regulation work in highly innovative markets. Secondly, I think it's important to understand that the platforms are radically diverse from one another. Some of them sell purely digital products. Some of them sell physical products. They interact with various interest groups in very different ways. They monetize transactions differently. Historically, when we have regulated, we've tended to lump together, the railroads, natural gas, electricity. These were companies that had fundamentally similar technologies and a certain amount of commonality as to what they needed. I think we can peel off pieces like telecommunications or labor relations and so on. But I think coming up with comprehensive regulation for groups as diverse as Facebook and Google and Amazon is going to be very difficult.
So I want to push back on Herb. I think it's prudent to use the word regulation to cover all the kinds of things that regulation does. So, for example, we have nutrition labeling and weights and measures in the United States, so that when we go out and buy bread and the label says a pound of bread and it contains wheat, we don't get a half a pound of bread with arsenic in it. Okay, and in the digital space, we don't have consumer protection laws. We don't have rights to data. We don't know the terms and conditions might say, and pay $10,000 and you're firstborn, and we would all click, I agree. So there's lots of kinds of regulation. And I think we want to distinguish consumer protection regulation. We want to distinguish things like interoperability from something like airline regulation, where the government said, airline number one, you can fly to Cincinnati at 9 o'clock on Tuesday for $275. Okay, that's a kind of regulation that I think Herb was talking about. And I just want to stress that there is a lot that you can do short of that actually flattens the playing field, makes it level, enables consumers to figure out what's high quality and what's low quality and move their business accordingly, which you really can't do in the world we've got now.
You just want to encourage those who are not speaking to please mute your microphones. Please, Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to, a little bit maybe between, One concern I have is a slippery slope one. How do we put together a regulatory institution and program that stays confined? We certainly don't want public interest regulation of the type that we see in the industry sectoral regulators, even at the federal level today. But on the other hand, let's take the big tech platforms. One feature they might have that might distinguish them from most of the monopolies that antitrust typically deals with is a seemingly boundless and growing scale economy advantage. A scale economy, scope economy, network effects. I mean, there's no end in sight for these companies. I don't mean to say they're going to be here forever, but they're going to be here probably outlast me, which is my end in sight. In any event, so one could imagine a world that would say, look, one way to ameliorate the problem or enable some increased prospect of entry that could ameliorate the market power of the platforms is to have interoperability, so that if I invent a new social network and people really like a couple of its features, I can go to Facebook and say, look, I'll pay you appropriate compensation. I want to plug into your network so that people who prefer me can have the advantage of the network economies you've so graciously built up over the last couple of decades. And compensation has to be a part of that story. Now, we wouldn't want to have refusal to deal law in general invite rivals to do that, because we're likely to get into a lot of trouble in terms of dynamic efficiencies and all that stuff. I'm sure David can explain in with much greater technical facility than I can. But we might conclude that because of the almost natural monopoly-like features of some of these platforms, and we don't want to regulate them like natural monopolies, the next best thing would be to have a very narrow, targeted, in effect, a special competition law on refusals to deal that would apply to the tech platforms. And if we could limit intervention in very surgical ways, along the lines Fiona was saying, then some kind of targeted regulation might make sense for the special problems, including the non-economic problems posed by the platforms.
Ramsey, if I may say so, I want to pick up on what Herb said, which is that it's almost always a disaster in an innovative industry when you start to heavily regulate, and maybe we can get smarter about regulation, but I doubt it. There's another elephant in the room, which no one has mentioned, which is China. And what we're going to do here is sort of put a collar on our own tech firms. China's not going to allow that, except in different ways. And then the question is, who gets the global leadership in AI? It's not going to be United States. It's going to be China. As we have to pay attention to the broader geopolitical consequences of all of this. And I find it interesting in this discussion and just about every other one I've been in, nobody is paying attention to this. And it's a major issue. It's not just a national security issue. It's an economic welfare question. And it's something that nobody seems to be willing to try and wrestle to the ground, or at least even get a modicum of understanding for. And you can't craft these policies anymore without paying attention to the role of China in the global economy.
Can I say something here? Because I think we haven't been
the best way to get innovation.
Let
Doug,
Thomas.
Doug, if I can let Thomas interject here for a second. And
No.
then after that,
So
I do want to make sure that we make time for questions. We've got a lot of great questions in the chat from the audience. So after Thomas, if Doug wants a minute, I'll give Doug a minute, and then we'll go to questions. So please, Thomas, go ahead.
No, yeah, I just wanted to react to what David was saying. I'm very puzzled by what he said. We haven't been listening to the same people, because if you've been talking to people who don't use China as an excuse every other sentence, I think we haven't been in the same rooms. I hear China being used as an excuse for all kinds of industrial policy, national champions everywhere, all the time. And by the way, the same was said by AT&T back in 1980s. One of the arguments AT&T made was that if you break up AT&T, the Russians are going to take over. That's like their own record saying that. So that's not new. I think maybe 10% of it is true. Everything else is complete BS, and we shouldn't be just like too naive to think that these guys are using it as a complete strategic argument when it has no validity. There are some cases where it does, but it's extremely rare. And the other thing is the idea that you're going to have a more competitive, even like the reason the US is so successful is because US companies has to fight first at home, and they get really fit and really good by fighting at home, and then they go and win the Olympics. What you're proposing is, oh, let's forget the US qualification for the Olympics because we don't want to tire our athlete before they go and compete. That's not going to work. I think that's just not, I think that's the wrong way to think about it. And I'm not sure we can make the case that these are all natural monopolies. They are natural monopolies in a world where we haven't regulated and haven't enforced anything against them for 20 years. Well, I think most industries would look like natural monopoly in that case. We don't know how the big tech would look like with just a little bit of tough regulations, like better scrutiny of mergers and a few more, requirements for privacy. And maybe it's going to be enough to bring in new companies. We don't know that. We don't know for a fact that these are natural monopolies. Definitely, like Amazon is definitely not a natural monopoly in retail. That's a competitive market. The cloud, maybe, maybe not. We don't know yet. I don't think we should take for granted that these are natural monopolies.
Great. Doug, did you want to get a word in edgewise?
No, Thomas really covered my point as well.
Okay, great. So we've got 12 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get to questions from our audience. So kick off with a question here from Carl Shapiro, who says, why does T say that static economics is dominated economics? There's a huge amount of work on the economics of innovation, including work that Fiona and I have done on innovation effects and mergers, question mark, question mark, question mark.
Well, let me just say that there's a lot of work being done on how competition drives innovation, and that's all very good work. There's almost no work that looks at the way in which innovation drives competition. That's my main point. And we're approaching the policy issue as if the causation is only one way. And so every time we do things which actually might crimp innovation of big tech companies, there are negative impacts for competition. They do swim lanes, and in other industries you find the same phenomena, but it's very, very poorly understood and very poorly documented.
Great, thank you for that. So I'm going to move on to a question from I guess it's Jan Brulik, who asks, to what extent is the current situation, or perhaps the situation 2 years ago in the antitrust community, similar to the situation in the financial community before the global financial crisis? For instance, some people such as James Kwok have argued that one of the causes of the crisis was a social psychological influence of the financial industry's representatives on the regulators. Don't you think that the antitrust defense bar might be exerting similar influence?
I think that's a fair comparison. I think we've pulled aside the curtain. Like, we have evidence that what we were doing doesn't work. And I think in financial services, they learned that all in 1 3-month period. It's taken us kind of 5 years, but I think we do have evidence that what we've been doing doesn't work.
Doug, I care to respond as a very eminent member of the antitrust bar?
Look, I think there's no question that if one spends most of his or her professional life representing a point of view, try though you might to say, well, how is the other side going to see it? And try though you might to develop arguments on both sides, your creativity is going to be tendentious, and your learning is going to go in that direction. And then, if you, to the extent you have a voice in policy, in good faith, it's going to be distorted a little bit by your experience. Having said that, there are a lot of people who go through the revolving door and have experience on both sides. That can be extremely illuminating. It certainly was for me. I won't speak for others on this panel. So I'm a little skeptical of arguments that say, oh, the problem is they've been captured by the defense bar. There have been plaintiffs in government agencies. For the most part, in antitrust, they haven't done a very good job, in my view. And I can tell you why I think that is. But so I think it's overstated, but it has a grain of truth. And I guess the answer is we ought to be careful about where we look for talent and for ideas. But I don't get the impression, frankly, that the academy is much more enlightened than the defense bar about antitrust policy.
All right, so next I'm going to go to a question from Faisal Chowdhury, a question after my own heart, as a matter of fact. He says, to what extent is emphasis on making antitrust the be all and end all, function in effect to reinforce the very free market ideology antitrust can be conceived of as a correction to? Is this one of the reasons it is appealing to see it as the be all and end all? So antitrust, there's a very thin line between, this is, from a progressive perspective, there's a very thin line between being pro antitrust and being sort of pro free markets everywhere, isn't there?
I don't think that's true historically. In fact, most of the people that want to spill antitrust over its boundaries tend to be interventionists, at least in my experience. We don't see the Mises Institution or Hayekians talking about spilling antitrust out into other areas. It's usually the neo-Brandeisians and folks who think like them that want to use it for all manner of things. And when they do that, they want to intervene.
I think also that, I mean, the question sounds to me like a bit like a question we could have asked 20 years ago. I think today, I think many of us are just much less ideological. Like, it's not like we want to intervene or we don't want to intervene. We just want to see the thing work well. And then, by the way, it's not just antitrust. I don't think anybody today would argue that you have to choose between antitrust and ex-ante regulations. All the big problems have a bit of both. And it's a purely pragmatic question, which one you want to do. And sometimes you want to do nothing. And sometimes you think the cost of interventions are too high. And even though you think the market is not delivering the perfect outcome, you still believe the government would only add something even more, so you still don't do anything. But these are mostly like it's empirical or practical questions. I don't think we want to go back to a world of ideology where, we're all free marketers. We all like free market, period. That's fine. We just then with the question is, how do you get them to work?
So I'm going to go now to a question from Gregoire Mancio. It feels like the antitrust environment as a whole has followed the same path than other state competencies. Those institutions are now more acting in reaction to than being birthplaces or catalysts of economic tendencies. It has led to the feeling of disempowerment of democratic processes, and the big companies case is today a clear example of that. But recent news seems to indicate that the US may be going back to a more Keynesian way of managing the economy. I'm not completely sure I see a question in that. So I'm going to go to Zemek Polka's question to David. On disasters, he says, I'm calling in from Poland where access to fiber optic internet costs $15 for 100 megabits a month. Wireless with unlimited data is $12 with the entire state covered. That's thanks to European antitrust and regulation. Okay, we haven't invented the internet or Facebook, but once they're around, we can let them squeeze profits out with no limits forever, or we can just make sure that the people get access. What do you think about that, David?
Well, look, I think when we think about profits, we have to distinguish between what I call, standard monopoly profits and then Schumpeterian rents and Ricardian rents. I think everybody benefits from Schumpeterian profits, which are those that come from innovation. Everybody benefits from Ricardian rents, where you get incentives for people to remove bottlenecks. And I'm not saying, this question, I think, relates to a whole bunch of factors that affect the cost of internet access that I'm really not an expert on, and that others have addressed. But I don't think it's a lack of competition from big tech that's causing the problem. There may be other problems that I'm not fully understanding.
Okay, we've got a few minutes. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, but I think there's still, it's still striking that so Europe does a lot of things well and a lot of things poorly, so like everybody, but it's striking that many of the things that work well in Europe were heavily inspired by whatever was happening in the US in the 1990s. And that is a fact. Now, it's not that's maybe the myth of the golden age. I'm not saying everything was perfect, but definitely, some of the pro-competition ideas that Europe took from the US playbook of the 1990s have worked well, and in part because they were, the good thing of Europe is it's a way, especially for countries with relatively weak institutions, to bypass some of the corruption issues, so that has helped a lot. but I think some of it is just because the ideas were genuinely good. And so I think, there's a lot to learn from that.
Absolutely. And the other thing to bear in mind, though, is that I don't think people understand very well the nature of competition, how it's changed with big tech, and we're using kind of yesterday's frameworks. And I would feel a lot more comfortable relying on competition, and we could feel more comfortable relying on competition if we understood the many diverse and different ways in which it now works. I don't think we do.
So, I want to wrap up here in the last 2 minutes. I want to go round robin and see if I can entreat each of our panelists to answer two questions. One is, how would you define platform if the definition, if whether to regulate or to break up turned on the definition? So in other words, how would you define platform for purposes of bringing to bear either regulation or antitrust? So in other words, what makes a company a platform? And the second question is, should firms be prevented from competing on their own platforms if they qualify as such? So is it okay to compete on your own? What's a platform? And is it okay to compete on your own platform? And I'll start with whoever wants to go first.
A platform is a market that intermediates between at least two groups of users, so that the manager has to regulate or control both the price levels and the participation levels on the two sides. On your second question, absolutely not as a general matter. I don't think platforms ought to be prohibited from selling their own goods as well as those of competitors. Most of the time, when they do that, it benefits consumers. For example, when Amazon sells AAA Amazon Basics batteries in competition with Duracell, who is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, consumers are better off, output goes up, and that's fundamentally a good thing. Too often the critics pick out isolated instances, and there are some. For example, the Elizabeth Warren literature focuses on some guy who invented a laptop stand, put it on Amazon, and then Amazon a year or so later came out with a look-alike and sold it at a lower price. That's the tail. That's not the horse when we're talking about Amazon products. Most of the time, Amazon enters markets with its own products when those products are characterized by high volume and high margins. And when that is true, it's basically, it's your traditional house brand versus name brand story, and house brands can break down the power of name brands.
Who would like to go next?
I'll jump in. I completely agree with Herb on the second question. Shouldn't have any kind of prohibition. A case-by-case assessment of a particular conduct that might be anti-competitive, would be appropriate, as it always is. But completely agree with her. On the first question, I kind of stumble on the motive for it in the following sense. I don't know why we need to have a category and have to define a platform. To me, the case for regulation, if any, would depend on identifying companies or maybe types of companies that pose such unique problems that we believe new laws, and especially targeted regulations, are required, and laws of general application aren't going to suffice. Now, if we thought there were a problem with some of the tech platforms, and I think it's an interesting conversation to have, I would say the necessary conditions, whether this is a definition of platform or not, I don't know, are one, huge network effects, and two, huge scale economies, data being the scale I have in mind there, that suggest that normal competitive disciplines, even over time, can't be expected to be successful. And of course, for the tech platforms, we could also add some of the non-economic concerns like privacy, misinformation, and so on, as a basis for targeted regulation. But I hesitate to think that we should embrace a regulation because of some category like platforms as if antitrust law can't deal with platforms. I mean, the Supreme Court can't deal with platforms, but antitrust law is capable of dealing with platforms.
Fiona, what do you think about this?
Don't have a definition of platform developed yet. I agree with Doug that analysis would be the way to go. And likewise, actually, with the vertical integration by the platform into a good, I think that's also a case-by-case kind of situation. I don't think flat rule one way or the other makes sense. One of the issues that's just really important in all industries, but particularly in technology, is that it moves fast. If we make a rule, the rule is going to be outdated after some number of years. I'd rather have a principle. This harms competition. And then it doesn't matter what business model is invented in the future, we can handle it.
I want to invite everybody into the world of telecom where these issues are easier. And the Nixon White House fought to separate transit from content in the 70s for the cable industry because they knew it was going to be a natural monopoly. Scalia was a staffer, backed that up, didn't happen. So come to my industry and we can divide transit from content and keep the people providing the transit from also providing the content.
Thank you. David, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would define a platform as a set of technical standards and protocols that enable different groups of people to be linked together for common good, and which requires constant curation and investment by a platform manager to yield innovation and the continuity of mutual gain. So that's how I define it. Do I want to see it regulated? No, I think enabling platforms to flourish is very important, and also facilitating a certain amount of platform-to-platform competition is fine. But I think it will happen naturally to a significant degree.
Thomas, please close this down.
Well, I think I agree on the second point. There is no difference between having like a retail store having its own brand and Amazon Basics conceptually. If there is a difference, it's a quantitative one. It's not, so then therefore defining it is not as important as just measuring things properly. The reason you might be worried about Amazon doing it is because of the scale at which they can do it and the fact that they become the only game in town. So, but I don't think then having defined it as a platform helps you make the case or not make the case. The reason we use platform, my sense is because it's just convenient to find. It's a bit like the reason we use fintech in finance. It's a very loose group of companies that have very little to do with each other. But we use the term because it's convenient. I think platform is a bit the same. And then the common thread is the idea of to what extent do they have return to scale. We know they're there. I would question the fact that I don't think they're as big as people make it out to be. Like a lot of data is enough to get to the scale where your algorithm work well. And an infinite amount of data, it doesn't get you much more than that. So I don't think we know that they are going to be natural monopolies, and you can have competing platforms.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank our panelists in the audience for a really stimulating session. So thank you very much for that. And we will adjourn for 45 minutes and then reconvene to discuss the new rent theory, a panel that will be moderated by Herb. And I invite you all to join us for that.